Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. It's your host Cole Anderson, and today's video unfortunately is going to have to be a little bit less intensive as far as detail goes than I would like it to be. I've been very busy lately preparing for my upcoming concert in Washington State on Vashon Island. I have a concert on September 7th at 7:30 p.m. on Vashon Island. So anyone who's in the area should definitely try to come if you can. But it's a big program, including the complete Miroir by Maurice Ravel, Fanny Hensel's Suite in E minor, as well as the complete Gershwin Etudes by Earl Wild. So quite a fun, varied program, but it is taking up a lot of my practice time. And I'm going to be leaving in a couple weeks for a rather extended period of travel for concerts and rehearsals on the West Coast. But I still wanted to make a video for you all, and I really did want to talk about Benjamin Britten because I really had a wonderful experience listening to this 27 CD set of Britten as a performer. And of course, I knew Britten as a performer before this. I've heard him conduct his own works, for example. I've heard little snippets of him collaborating with Sviatoslav Richter on Mozart sonatas, but I didn't realize that there was actually so much material out there of him purely as a performer. So I got to have a good time doing kind of a deep dive over the course of many weeks, listening through all these recordings. And most of them are Britten as a conductor. None of it is his own music, it's all other composers' music. So I was already familiar with his work conducting his own music, of course, which is generally the best performances are Britten's own recordings. But I was amazed at the breadth of repertoire. Britten had some very interesting preferences as far as repertoire goes, and so these works that he decided to record are oftentimes really fascinating, and he has a very unique take on them. So I'm going to do a kind of quick aerial survey, and I'll zoom in for a couple of my favorites. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get quite as detailed an analysis, but at least this will perhaps pique your interest to go and take a look at more of Britten's work as a conductor and pianist. So right off the bat, the set opens with a magnificent performance of the St. John Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach, a very touching and moving performance. And then there's another opera, actually, that I was unfamiliar with up to this time, which was The Fairy Queen by Henry Purcell. Also in a wonderful performance. As I listened through, I found things that were totally new to me, like The Fairy Queen or the performance of St. John Passion. And then also some things that were familiar. I think Britten's recordings of the Brandenburg Concerti, for example, are quite famous and quite popular. And perhaps for some listeners, they might seem a little bit too comfortable and gemütlich. There is a certain kind of Hobbit-like comfortableness about them, certainly, which is very different from the more daring way that some recent ensembles have taken with these pieces. But nonetheless, they're very beautiful, very persuasive in many details. Some works that are very familiar to me, like the Mozart Concerti that he recorded with Clifford Curzon as a soloist, were absolutely magnificent. Those are some of the greatest recordings of Mozart Concerti ever. It's number 20 in D minor and also number 27 in B flat major. I won't play any of that right now because that probably highlights Curzon a little bit more, but Britten's support, really wonderful and sensitive. I would like to play a little bit from his recording of the G minor symphony, the late G minor symphony by Mozart, with the English Chamber Orchestra. Britten seems to have had a very special relationship with the English Chamber Orchestra. I think his recordings with them are some of his best work as a conductor, and I was just absolutely delighted and in seventh heaven listening to this recording of one of my favorite symphonies by Mozart. In particular, I really enjoyed how he nailed the tempi in the minuet, the third movement, and also in the finale, which I think most conductors take both movements too slow. But he got exactly the right kind of balance between forward momentum and detail. So that gives you a little taste of that recording, which is one of my favorites now. There's something wonderfully uncomplicated and direct and kind of childlike in the best sense of the word about Britten's interpretations. He seems to cut through a lot of the traditions and a lot of the inhibitions that seem to constrict many performers. There's a naturalness and kind of a freedom to what he does, which at the same time is very inevitable. Unfortunately, his own recording of a Mozart concerto, the earlier A major concerto, is not one of his best. It's a live performance, and you can too clearly hear that he was a bit nervous in that performance and kind of rushing ahead. His various recordings with the Aldeburgh Festival Orchestra, though, are quite fun, even though that ensemble, at least in those recordings, was nowhere near the level of polish and finesse of the English Chamber Orchestra. This was the orchestra for his own festival, the Aldeburgh Festival, that Britten formed himself, and they're all live recordings that were actually made during the festival. So it's quite fun to hear them, and there is definitely a kind of lack of concern for perfection in some of those recordings, but they're still fun. In particular, I really liked the recording of the Farewell Symphony by Haydn. It was quite interesting listening to his recordings made with Sviatoslav Richter. These again are live recordings from his festival. I was surprised that some of the more famous recordings were actually a little bit disappointing. Famously, they recorded the Schubert Fantasy, and also there's a recording of the famous D major Sonata for two pianos by Mozart. Richter, in his notebooks, talked about these performances, and he expressed that they didn't really have enough rehearsal time. They only had a couple of rehearsals, I think, right before the performance. And I think that you can hear that in those performances, even though they are full of a lot of energy and a lot of fun, and probably were great fun to hear in person. They're also a little bit slapdash, and the ensemble's not particularly tight. I think you can also pick out that Britten, as a pianist, was not necessarily at his best in this kind of precise virtuoso technique that Mozart, for example, requires. On the other hand, some of the more subtle Schubert variation sets are magnificently played. I particularly like their take on the Divertissement, the Andantino with variations. So that's a really beautiful performance. Unfortunately, I can only play a little bit of it right here, but I strongly recommend looking it up. And also the variations in A flat that they recorded together are very, very beautiful, and they're not really marred by the same kind of rushing and ensemble mishaps that are a problem in the recordings of the Mozart D major and the Schubert Fantasy. But I think you can really hear that actually Richter and Britten had a very sympathetic kind of personality to each other. They were both favored a kind of simplicity of style, which could seem, again, kind of childlike in the best sense of the word. So one recording I wanted to talk about a bit was probably one of the more well-known recordings, actually, by Britten. This is his work with Mstislav Rostropovich, the great Russian cellist. They recorded several works together. One of their most famous recordings is probably of Schubert's Arpeggione Sonata, since we're talking about Schubert. I'll talk about this as well. And it's an absolutely magical recording. Words hardly do it justice, actually. When I was a student, I actually heard some people speak kind of slightingly about this recording. I remember at Oberlin, I had a cellist friend who, when I mentioned this particular recording and how much I liked it, he said, "Oh, isn't that the one where Benjamin Britten makes a retard in the first phrase?" And it was said in kind of a slightly derogatory way, like, "Oh, yeah, kind of bad taste to take a retard in the first phrase." And probably I would agree with that in general. You don't want to slow down right at the beginning of a piece necessarily, but this was a little bit of a special situation, and I actually think that Britten's approach is very appropriate. Let's hear a little bit of that so you can hear what I'm talking about. So there it is. There's actually more than one retard even in that first phrase. I have to say that I think it actually really works, and the reason why I think that is because Schubert, I believe, intentionally wrote that opening to be played a little bit quasi-recitativo in the style of a recitative. The continual eighth note motion of the accompaniment, which otherwise keeps going pretty much unabated for the rest of the piece, is absent in this introduction. And I've always felt that people play it a little bit too much in a constrained kind of way, whereas it's probably meant to be a little bit fantasy-like, to have this kind of freedom to it. And the entire performance is actually like that. They take much more time together than you generally hear. You know, so often you hear performances of this sonata which are kind of, I would say, objective or classical in style, in which everything is kind of square and the tempo is very consistent. And that can be done in a very effective way, but I always feel like something is missing in those performances. You know, a piece like this one, and many of Schubert's sonatas, in fact, contain this kind of inner world of emotion, which is not very obvious on the surface. And I feel like you have to dig a little bit deeper in the way you play. You have to play in a slightly more wayward and unpredictable way to actually drag some of that out. If you just play it very, very strict and kind of straight and metronomic, the magic of this world doesn't always come to the forefront. I think oftentimes Schubert was a great composer, but he didn't always notate down to the last detail all these little things about interpretation, about the feeling of individual passages. I'm sure he was very much an improviser and very much someone who was inspired in the moment. So I think you need a little bit of that when you play these pieces. And so I was so inspired when I first heard this piece played by Britten and Rostropovich, because of the freedom that they had and the kind of magic that they created with the flexibility in tempo. Let's hear a little bit more of the first movement, and then I also want to play a little segment from the second movement so you can hear just the kind of magic that they create together. To me, it's very marvelous playing. It really feels like they get to the heart of this music and they are really feeling every phrase with a kind of sincerity of emotion, which is very touching and very rarely encountered actually in performances of this piece. And it's very rhetorical, the way that they shape the gestures, very speaking. It never feels like it's locked up in a box or square. ever. So I highly recommend listening to this whole recording. You do have to be in the right mood and you have to have plenty of time because they take the repeat in the first movement and they don't hurry through anything. So you have to be in kind of a relaxed frame of mind, put it on, and just kind of let this world be built for you. It's really quite extraordinary when it happens. Now, of course, I knew this recording before. This is probably the most famous recording that they made together, but there are some less well-known recordings that are on this complete set that I was absolutely delighted to hear, and probably the most exciting one was to hear their performance of Frank Bridges' Cello Sonata, which is an amazing piece of music. I've never heard performed in concert before. I'm sure there must be some recordings of it and people probably play it who really specialize in this kind of music, but it doesn't seem to be a centerpiece of the repertoire, and I can't understand why. This recording is absolutely amazing. So that alone was practically worth the entire entrance fee of the whole set. And Britten is just at his absolute best in his playing here as well. You can hear this kind of amazing color that he brings and how he manages to really support Rostropovich, how powerful his playing is without overshadowing the cello part. So another high point for me was Britten's Granger disc. He includes a selection of orchestral and mostly vocal works, and there was one in particular that just absolutely blew me away when I first heard it. It's a sea shanty setting, actually, Shallow Brown. Percy Granger, of course, was famous for these amazing folk song settings. He was actually a pioneer in going out and recording folk songs in the English countryside. He was one of the first people who did that with pen and paper and also with phonograph records. And then he made arrangements of many of these folk songs, kind of in the style of the way he heard them sung in person by the actual folk singers. This arrangement of Shallow Brown is just absolutely mesmerizing. It shows the usual kind of inventiveness that Granger had with orchestration. So this recording also features the wonderful bass baritone John Shirley Quirk. I wasn't able to get a score for this, so unfortunately I just have to play you the music. So here we go. Let's hear a little bit of Shallow Brown. So that entire disc, his whole Granger disc, is just absolutely delightful and magical. I couldn't recommend it strongly enough. So of course, in a collection like this, you do run into Sir Peter Pears, who, as you may or may not know, was Britten's life partner and also his musical collaborator for most of Britten's career. In fact, most of the big roles in Britten's big operas, like Peter Grimes, were actually written with Pears in mind. However, for some, the proliferation of Peter Pears's voice on this set might be a mixed bag. Not everyone considers his voice to be ideally beautiful in the normal sense, and it's quite true. It's a very intimate kind of chamber voice. It has a little bit more of a fluting quality in the high registers, and it's definitely not super powerful. Also, he affected a kind of quite slow vibrato, which occasionally verged a bit on the edge of a wobble. However, for me, his obvious intelligence and sensitivity and the way that they work together is absolutely magnificent. And I even started to kind of like the timbre of his voice after a while, after I'd been listening to it for a while. You know, it was a little odd at first, but once I got used to it, I kind of really liked it. One amazing recording which really features Peter Pears on this collection is the Dream of Gerontius, Edward Elgar's wonderful oratorio, although he didn't like to call it an oratorio, I think. But nonetheless, it's an amazing piece of music, a really moving piece of music, very rarely heard, but really powerful. And I think Peter Pears is really magnificent in that. And Britten's interpretation is also one of the best I've ever heard, one of the most convincing that I've ever heard. So it would be a great recording to get introduced to that piece through. They did record a lot of the big Schubert and Schumann collections. There's Schumann's Dichterliebe, Schubert's Die Winterreise, Die Schöne Müllerin, and many other individual songs, famous and obscure. Although I liked all those recordings, I wasn't always totally convinced by their way of approaching this music. Maybe I'm just spoiled from having grown up listening to Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau do all this repertoire. Maybe I just have that in my ear too much. There were a lot of things that I thought were very interesting and very different, and Britten's playing is always so colorful and so natural and kind of magical, the way that he does the piano part. He completely avoids the kind of self-effacing, dry kind of approach that you sometimes hear from career accompanists. It's just always really imaginative and really wonderful. So the work of theirs that I found to be the most convincing was, again, the English composers. And, well, I'll just let the music speak for itself. So here's one selection, a shorter song in its entirety. This is Betelgeuse by Gustav Holst.
Nothing that joys or grieves the unstirred multitude of leaves, nor a ghost of evil or good haunts the gold multitude.
So that's probably about all I have time for. This set was really amazing, an amazing experience for me to listen to. I know you're probably wondering, where do I find the time to listen to all this stuff? It's usually when I'm doing stuff like doing dishes or driving in the car, or stuff where or folding my laundry, or just kind of stuff where I have to do mechanical tasks. That's when I keep up with my listening as much as I can. I did mention my album coming out. It's been delayed actually coming out on streaming platforms, but it should be up pretty soon. But if you do want to get it right away, you can find it on the shop on my Patreon page, which I have linked in the description box, and I have it available for download there with high quality WAV files, which should be fully compatible with all your favorite music programs, including Apple Music. If you so choose, you can also sign up to make a monthly donation through Patreon to help support the channel. I really appreciate that whenever. If it's something that you can do, I really appreciate that. But also, just buying the album to the shop is a great way to support the channel with a one-time payment if that is something that interests you. So otherwise, I'll just sign off for now. I need to get back to practicing, but I'll see you all next week. I'll upload something next week before I leave on my journeys. So keep practicing. Take care. I'll talk to you later.